Hello, lovelies. Lena here. Some women have a way of making you feel seen without saying a word. This is the story of an architect who sat at the same corner table every morning for 3 years tad and never once flipped her receipt over. Until she did. 36 years, one cafe, and a heart drawn in black pen that changed everything. Let's begin.
The receipt was supposed to go straight into the trash. That's what I do. I pay, I tip, I leave. 3 years of the same routine, same corner table, same flat white and almond croissant, same 11 minutes to get back to the office before my calendar turns red. The Blue Jar Cafe is not a place where things happen to me. It's a place where I fuel up and move on. So I don't have a good explanation for why I flipped it over. I'm a 30-year-old architect. I color code my calendar. I have never once been late to a meeting, and I have never in my adult life read a horoscope for anything other than comedic purposes. My world runs on measurements, load tolerances, and deadlines. Not on small handwritten things tucked onto the backs of cafe receipts. And yet there I was, sitting at my corner table on a Tuesday that had given me zero reason to expect anything interesting, staring at a tiny lopsided heart drawn in black pen on the back of my receipt like it was a structural anomaly I needed to solve. It wasn't a stamp, not a pre-printed logo. Someone had drawn it by hand. You could tell by the slight pressure variation, the way the left side had a small upward flick where the pen lifted quickly. The kind of mark people make when something is habit, when they don't even think about it anymore. I looked up. Nora was at the counter, taking another order, pen moving fast across her notepad. Same dark curly hair pulled back. Same unhurried way of moving that somehow kept pace with a full breakfast rush. I'd read her name tag approximately 600 times in 3 years without ever saying her name out loud, which is either very normal or slightly embarrassing depending on how you look at it. She set down a coffee at the next table, caught someone's eye, smiled, the real kind, not the service kind, and moved on. I looked back at the receipt. I flipped it over, confirmed it was mine, my order, my total, and flipped it back. The heart was still there, which, yes, is how physical objects work, but I needed a second to process. I picked up my own pen and held the tip next to the drawing. Same ink color, same approximate weight. I was doing forensic analysis on a doodle at 7:51 in the morning. If you're new here, subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing who's out there. She probably did it to everyone's receipts. Some kind of cafe warmth thing, a small touch management encouraged. Or maybe she was just a person who drew hearts on things when her hands were idle. Neither of those explanations required me to sit here assigning meaning to it. I folded the receipt and dropped it in my bag and opened my laptop. The structural review was in 9 minutes. I had 17 unread emails and a cantilever calculation that needed one more pass. These were real, concrete, measurable things that deserved my attention. I opened the right file. I read the first line 3 times without retaining any of it. By the time I reached the office, I had constructed and quietly dismantled 4 separate theories about the heart, and I was furious with myself in that low-grade private way you can't really explain to anyone. It was a doodle. It was 2 centimeters of ballpoint pen on a piece of thermal paper that was going to fade in 6 months anyway. I was a professional with a 9 o'clock meeting and real responsibilities, and I had spent the entire walk to work thinking about a cafe receipt like it was a message in a bottle. I sat down at my desk, pulled out the receipt to throw it away, looked at the heart, put it back in my bag. I went back the next morning. That part isn't surprising. I go every morning. It's my routine. It means nothing. What was slightly harder to explain was why I showed up 4 minutes earlier than usual, why I'd chosen a shirt that wasn't wrinkled, and why I'd had a low-level argument with myself in the elevator about whether or not to say her name out loud when she came to take my order. I lost the argument. I didn't say it. Nora brought my flat white and almond croissant without me asking, same as always, set them down with that small professional nod, and walked away before I could think of a single coherent thing to say. Which was fine. I hadn't planned to say anything. I opened my laptop, answered 2 emails, and spent the next 6 minutes watching her work in my peripheral vision like some kind of malfunctioning surveillance system. She was good at her job in a way that's hard to describe without sounding like I was paying too much attention, which I wasn't. I was simply observing, professionally. She remembered that the man at table 4 took no sugar before he said it. She refilled a water glass the second it hit the halfway mark. When a woman came in with a stroller that wouldn't fit through the gap between tables, Nora had already moved the chair before the woman finished her apologetic smile. Small things. The kind of things that only register if you're looking. I was looking. When she brought the check, I kept my eyes on my laptop screen with the focused expression of someone doing very important work. She set it face down on the table. They always set them face down. And I waited until she was 3 steps away before I picked it up. Turned it over immediately. Blank. Just the total, the tax, the timestamp. I sat with that for a second longer than made sense, then reminded myself that I had not been hoping for anything, because that would imply I'd been thinking about this, which I hadn't. I paid at the counter for the first time in 3 years. I told myself it was for efficiency. Nora took my card without comment, processed it, handed it back, and then, while the machine was still printing, tore the receipt from the roll, flipped it over on the counter without looking down, drew something in one quick motion, and slid it across to me face down. She'd already turned toward the next customer before I touched it. I waited until I was outside to flip it over. Heart. Same pen. Same lopsided left side. I stood on the sidewalk in 42-degree Portland air, holding a cafe receipt with both hands, like it was a document requiring legal review. A man in a rain jacket walked around me without comment, because this is Portland, and people have seen stranger things. I folded the receipt carefully. Not the crumple and pocket move, the actual fold along the middle move, and put it in the same pocket as yesterday's. The walk to the office took 8 minutes. I spent 6 of them in a quiet negotiation with myself about what any of this meant. The most rational explanation was still habit. She did it for everyone. It was muscle memory. It was nothing personal. The problem with that explanation was that I had watched her hand 4 other receipts to 4 other customers that morning, and hadn't seen her draw on a single one. Which either meant I was wrong about the habit theory, or I had somehow become the kind of person who tracks a barista's receipt drawing patterns across a sample size of 5. Both possibilities were uncomfortable in different ways. By Thursday, I had 3 receipts in the inside pocket of my work bag, which is a sentence I would like to never say out loud to another human being. They weren't stacked randomly. They were in chronological order, which is worse. I hadn't done it on purpose. I'd just taken them out of my pocket each night and set them on my nightstand, and somehow the nightstand had become a small archive of evidence that something was happening, even if I couldn't name it yet. Friday morning, I sat down at my corner table, and Nora brought my order before I'd taken my coat off. She set down the flat white, the croissant, and then, separately, deliberately, like it was its own thing, a folded receipt, face down, with no food attached to it. Just the receipt. She was already walking away. I opened it. A heart, same as always, but underneath it, in small, careful handwriting, "You looked like you needed a good morning." I read it twice. Looked up. She was taking an order across the room and not looking at me, but the corner of her mouth was doing something that wasn't quite a smile, and wasn't quite not one either. I looked back down at the receipt. Then I did something I hadn't done in that cafe in 3 years. I laughed. The question sat in my chest for 11 days. I know it was 11 because I counted the receipts. 7 hearts, 4 blank ones on mornings she wasn't working, which I'd kept anyway out of some archival compulsion I refused to examine too closely. 11 days of sitting at the same corner table, ordering the same thing, watching her move through the cafe with that unhurried competence, and saying absolutely nothing beyond thank you, and occasionally this is perfect about the coffee, which was true, but also the safest sentence I owned. The problem wasn't that I didn't have things to say. The problem was that everything I'd rehearsed in my head sounded wrong the moment I imagined actually saying it. Too casual felt dismissive. Too direct felt alarming. I'm an architect. I spend my professional life making decisions with incomplete information, committing to structural choices before the ground is fully tested. I am, by most measures, decisive. And yet, here I was, paralyzed by a 2-centimeter drawing on thermal paper, unable to find a single sentence that felt like the right load-bearing wall. She wasn't working Monday or Tuesday that week. I know because I went both mornings and a different person brought my order. Someone named Derek, who did not draw anything on my receipt and made my flat white slightly too hot. By Wednesday, I had run out of patience with myself. 11 days was long enough. I was going to say something, or I was going to stop counting receipts and go back to being a normal person who fueled up and moved on. Those were the only 2 options. I'd eliminated everything in between. She was behind the counter when I walked in, back to the room, restocking cups. I sat down. She came over without being flagged, set down my order, and was already turning to leave when I said, out loud, with my actual voice, to another human being, "Can I ask you something?" She turned back, not startled, more like she'd been expecting a question eventually, and was mildly curious which one it would be. "Sure," she said, and shifted her weight slightly, the way people do when they're genuinely settling in to listen rather than just waiting for you to finish. "Why do you always draw hearts on my receipts?" The cafe kept going around us, the espresso machine, someone's chair scraping, a conversation 2 tables over about a dog. Nora looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully decode, something between amusement and something quieter underneath it. Then she said, "Because it's been 3 years, and I was waiting for you to notice. Not notice the hearts. Just notice." The distinction landed somewhere in my sternum and stayed there. I didn't have a prepared response for that. All 11 days of rehearsal, and I had not once considered that she might answer with something that honest. I'd expected deflection, maybe a laugh. Maybe the habit explanation I'd been quietly hoping was wrong. Not this. Not her standing at my corner table in a Wednesday morning rush, telling me with complete composure that she had been waiting. 3 years is a long time to wait for someone who color codes her calendar and tips exactly 15% and has read your name tag 600 times without saying it once. "I'm sorry it took me that long," I said, which wasn't what I'd planned to say either. But it was the truest thing I had. Something shifted in her expression then. Not dramatically, not a movie moment, just a small softening around the eyes, the kind that means something landed correctly. "You're here now," she said. And then, because the espresso machine had just beeped and there were 3 tables waiting, she gave me that small professional nod and walked back to work, like she hadn't just rearranged something fundamental about my Tuesday. I sat with my flat white going lukewarm for the next 20 minutes. I answered 0 emails. The croissant was excellent, and I didn't taste a single bite of it. When I got up to leave, I went to the counter instead of the table payment. Nora was there, making change for someone. When the other customer stepped away, she looked at me with a neutral expression that I was now understanding was not indifference but patience. A very specific kind, the kind that doesn't perform itself. "I'm Callie," I said. "I know," she said. "Credit card." "Right." I felt my face do something involuntary. "I've never said your name out loud either." "Nora." She handed me my receipt, already folded, face down, and said, "I know that too." When I unfolded it on the sidewalk, there was a heart, same as always. But this time she'd written something underneath it in that small, careful handwriting. "Same time tomorrow?" Not a question, exactly. More like an assumption made gently, offered as an invitation, leaving me the door in case I needed it. I stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and read it twice, and then pulled out my phone and moved my 7:45 calendar block, 15 minutes earlier, which is either very romantic or very me. And honestly, at this point, I'm not sure there's a difference. I was back at 7:27 the next morning. She was already there. If this story has been pulling you in, my Patreon is where I keep everything I couldn't fit here. Longer chapters, bonus scenes, stories that go further and deeper into every moment I had to leave at the edge. Everything's linked right below. 7:27 became our time. Not by agreement. We never sat down and negotiated it. Never made it official the way I make everything official. It just calcified into fact the way good things do when nobody panics and ruins them. She'd have my order ready before I sat down. I'd stay 20 minutes longer than I used to. We talked the way people talk when they're still figuring out the shape of each other. Carefully at first, then less carefully, then not carefully at all. I learned things. She'd grown up in Medford, 3 hours south, youngest of 4, the only one who'd left. She'd moved to Portland at 21 with $400 and a cooking school acceptance letter she ultimately didn't use because she'd taken the cafe job to cover rent and discovered she liked the work more than she'd expected. She read actual physical books, multiple at a time, with no system for tracking which she'd finished. She had strong opinions about bridges, not structurally, aesthetically. And when I told her what I did for a living, her face did something genuinely delighted that I stored somewhere private and returned to more than once. She asked good questions. Not polite questions, not small talk questions. The kind that meant she'd been listening to the previous answer. When I mentioned offhand that I hadn't spoken to my mother in 8 months, she didn't fill the silence with reassurance. She just said, "That sounds heavy to carry around every day," and moved on when I didn't elaborate, and somehow the not pressing felt more respectful than any follow-up would have. By the second week, I was staying until 8:15, which meant I was arriving at the office with less buffer than I liked, and compensating by eating lunch at my desk. My colleague Renata noticed. Renata notices everything and has no filter between noticing and saying, which is either her best or worst quality depending on the day. "You're glowing," she said, on a Wednesday, with the specificity of someone filing evidence. "Either you started meditating or you met someone." I told her I'd started meditating. She gave me the look she reserves for statements she finds professionally insulting. The morning it went wrong started perfectly, which should have been a warning. Portland in December has approximately 4 good mornings a month. The rest are gray and damp in that particular Northwest way that's not dramatic enough to be interesting, but relentless enough to affect your mood without your permission. This was one of the 4. Clear sky, cold enough to make the air feel clean, the kind of morning where the city looks like someone sharpened it overnight. Nora was at the door when I arrived, not serving, just standing in the small entrance alcove with her coat on and a coffee in her hand. Off the clock, I realized. She'd been opening shift all week, which meant she was done. We'd never been in the same space when she wasn't working, and for a half second neither of us said anything, the way you pause when context shifts unexpectedly, and your brain needs a moment to catch up. "Good morning," she said. "You're leaving," I said at the same time. We both stopped. She smiled, the full one, not the professional nod, and said, "I have 2 hours before my afternoon class. I was going to walk down to the river." She paused, not quite a question, but leaving space for one. "You could come, if your calendar has a gap." My calendar did not have a gap. My calendar had a site review call at 9, and a permit submission deadline that I'd been nursing along for a week. I knew this without checking because I always know what's in my calendar. It's one of the few things I'm genuinely good at. I opened my mouth to say exactly that. "Sure," I said. We walked 4 blocks to the Willamette in the sharp December air, coffees in hand, talking about nothing important. A bookstore she liked on Burnside. A building I'd worked on that she'd apparently walked past 100 times without knowing. The river was low and silver, and the morning light was doing something unreasonable to the surface of it. I kept my eyes on the path because if I looked at her too much while she was talking, I lost track of the sentences. Somewhere around the Morrison Bridge, she said, "Can I ask you something?" Which is what I'd said to her 11 days before. And the symmetry of it made something in my chest do a small, involuntary thing. "You haven't asked me anything yet," I said. "In all this time. You answer questions, but you don't ask them." "I've been saving them," she said. "For what?" She looked at me sideways in that way she had. Calm, like she had all the time in the world. For when I had enough answers to know which questions were worth asking. She looked back at the river. "Do you want to have dinner with me? Not coffee. Not accidentally. An actual dinner, where we both know what it is." The river kept moving. Somewhere behind us, a cyclist called out a passing warning. I had a site review in 43 minutes, and a permit deadline, and a very full calendar that had not accounted for standing on a bridge in December being asked a question I'd been circling for 2 weeks without admitting it. "Yes," I said. "Obviously, yes." She nodded like this confirmed something she'd already known but had needed to hear anyway. We stood there another minute, the city moving around us, before she turned and said, "You should probably go. You have that look." "What look?" "The one where you're calculating how late you're going to be." I was 7 minutes late to the site review. Worth it. The restaurant was her choice, which I'd insisted on, and she'd picked somewhere small and Italian on a side street in Northeast that I'd walked past a dozen times without ever going in. 12 tables, candles and wine bottles, a chalkboard menu that changed daily. The kind of place that doesn't take reservations and doesn't need to because the regulars know to arrive before 7. She knew the owner by name. He greeted her at the door with the particular warmth reserved for people who have been coming long enough to feel like furniture in the best possible sense. I'd stood in front of my closet for 22 minutes, which is 21 minutes longer than I normally spend on that decision. I own good clothes. I work with clients. I do presentations. I know how to dress. The problem wasn't the clothes. The problem was that I kept putting things on and taking them off because none of them felt like the right answer to the question of who I wanted to be when I walked through that door. And at some point I had to acknowledge that no blazer was going to solve that particular structural issue. I arrived 2 minutes early. She was already there. She'd changed out of her work clothes into something simple. Dark trousers, a rust-colored top that made her look like she'd been painted into the room deliberately. Her hair was down. I'd seen it down before, slow mornings at the cafe, but not like this, not in candlelight, not aimed at me specifically. I sat down across from her and made a private decision to behave like a functioning adult for the duration of the evening. "You look like you're bracing for a board meeting," she said, within 40 seconds of my sitting down. "I'm relaxed," I said. "You've straightened the fork twice." I put my hand in my lap. "I'm relaxed." She laughed. That real one. The one that meant she meant it. And something in my shoulders came down about 2 inches without my permission. The owner brought wine we hadn't ordered, red, with a small nod to Nora that suggested it was on the house, or at least on long-standing goodwill, and she thanked him in a way that made it clear this happened regularly, and she never took it for granted. We talked through the bread and into the pasta. She told me about her afternoon class, a literature course she was taking at Portland State, not for a degree, just because she'd wanted to read Toni Morrison with other people in the room. I told her about the permit submission I'd nearly missed that afternoon, and she listened with actual interest, asking a follow-up about zoning restrictions that was more informed than most people manage. And when I asked how she knew anything about zoning, she shrugged and said she'd looked it up after I'd mentioned the project 2 weeks ago. She'd looked it up. I sat with that for a moment. The quiet effort of it. The fact that she'd gone home after a shift on her feet and read about zoning law because I'd mentioned it in passing. Nobody had done that for me before. Not like that. Not as a small, unremarkable thing, the way she did it, Like, of course you pay attention to what people care about. You're doing it again, she said. Doing what? Going somewhere in your head and not telling me where. I set down my fork. I'm trying to figure out why this is so easy, I said, which was more honest than I'd intended. But the wine was good, and she had a way of making honesty feel less like exposure and more like conversation. She considered that. Maybe it's not supposed to be hard, she said. Not everything has to be a load-bearing wall, Callie. She'd remembered that phrase. I'd used it exactly once, 3 weeks ago, explaining something about a project, and she'd filed it away and pulled it out now with the precision of someone who listens not just to respond, but to understand. I looked at her across the small table in the candlelight and felt something I hadn't felt in long enough that I'd half convinced myself I was past needing it. The specific vertigo of being genuinely seen by someone who chose to look. We split a tiramisu neither of us had planned to order. Outside, the street was quiet. That particular midweek quiet of a neighborhood that goes to bed at a reasonable hour. We stood on the sidewalk in the cold air, neither of us moving toward the direction of home, the conversation winding down the way good conversations do. Slowly, without wanting to. She was the one who closed the distance. Not dramatically. A step, just one. Close enough that I could see the small scar above her left eyebrow I'd never noticed before, and the way her breath made a small cloud in the cold. She looked at me the way she had that first morning at the river, patient and clear, giving me every door in case I needed one. I didn't need one. She kissed me softly, briefly, the kind of kiss that's less an ending and more a question. Are we doing this? Are we sure? Is this real? When she pulled back, she was close enough that I could see her trying not to smile and failing. Hi, she said quietly, like we were meeting for the first time. Hi, I said back. We stood there another minute in the cold, the city going about its business around us, and neither of us felt any particular urgency to move. She had an early shift. I had a 7 o'clock call. We both had full lives that had been running fine without this, and were now, apparently, going to have to figure out how to run with it. Same time tomorrow? I said. She laughed. You're going to say that every time now, aren't you? Probably, I said. Is that a problem? She took my hand on the walk to the corner where our directions split, held it the way people hold things they're not ready to put down, and said, Ask me again in 20 years. I thought about that the whole walk home. I thought about it in the elevator. I stood in my kitchen in my coat, drinking a glass of water, and thought about it some more, turning it over like a blueprint, looking for the load-bearing parts. 20 years. Like it was already a given. Like she'd done the math. The call came on a Thursday in February, 3 months into whatever Nora and I were doing, which we hadn't named yet, because naming things felt like something that required a conversation we were both apparently content to keep not having. My firm had submitted a proposal for a mixed-use development in Chicago. Significant project, 18 months minimum. The kind of thing that gets you featured in trade publications and referred to in meetings for the next decade. I'd been the lead on the submission. I knew it was good. I hadn't let myself think too hard about what good would mean if it came back as yes. It came back as yes. My boss called me into her office at 4 p.m. and delivered the news with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting to say a thing out loud. Lead architect, full relocation package, Chicago office setup, housing stipend for the first 6 months. She said the word career-defining twice without irony. I sat across from her desk and nodded in the right places and said the right things about being honored and excited and ready, and I was, professionally, structurally, in every part of me that runs on ambition and drafting software. That part was completely certain. The other part was doing the math on 3 months. I didn't tell Nora that night. She had a closing shift and I had a headache I wasn't going to describe accurately. So I went home and made pasta badly and sat on my kitchen floor eating it out of the pot because I hadn't set the table, which is something I never do. My apartment felt different than it had 6 months ago, though nothing in it had changed. That's the thing about people getting under your skin. They don't rearrange the furniture. They just make the furniture feel like yours in a way it wasn't before. I told her Saturday morning. Not at the cafe. She was off. And I'd texted to ask if I could come over, which I'd done exactly twice before, both times with specific practical pretexts. This time I had no pretext, which she either didn't notice or noticed and didn't mention, which was very Nora. Her apartment was small and warm and smelled like coffee and old paperbacks, which should not be a thing that makes a person feel things, but here we were. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. The project, the timeline, the relocation package, what it meant professionally. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, both hands wrapped around her mug, and then she said, "That's a remarkable opportunity. Not what does this mean for us, or what are you going to do? Just that. Calm and genuine and slightly devastating in its generosity." "It is," I said. 18 months. Maybe longer if the project extends. "Chicago's not far," she said. "Flight's 2.5 hours. "Nora, I'm just saying it's not across an ocean. Are you—" I stopped, started again. "Are you going to tell me what you're actually thinking?" She set down her mug, looked at me with that expression I'd come to understand was not distance, but precision. She chose her words the way I chose structural materials, for load capacity. "I think you should go," she said. "I think you've been working toward something like this for a long time, and it landed, and you should go do it. That's what I'm actually thinking." "That's the only thing you're thinking." A pause, small and honest. "No," she said, "but the other things aren't reasons for you to stay." That sentence sat between us in the warm apartment for a long moment. Outside, Portland was doing its February thing, gray and damp, the trees still bare, a world waiting to decide whether to become something different. I looked at her on the couch with her coffee and her books stacked on every surface, and her complete infuriating willingness to want good things for me even when those things cost her something. And I understood with a clarity that felt almost architectural that I had drastically underestimated what 3 months could do to a person. "I don't want to do the thing where we say we'll make it work and then slowly don't," I said. "Then let's not do that thing." "Nora. Statistically, Callie." She said my name the way she said everything, with patience, but with weight underneath it. "I'm not a statistic. You're not a statistic. If you go and it gets hard and we lose this, that's something we'll deal with if it happens. But you're not allowed to preemptively grieve something that hasn't ended." I took the job. I gave my notice at my apartment 2 weeks later. Sublet, 6 months, option to extend. I told myself it was practical. It was practical. It was also the first decision I'd made in my adult life, where the professional logic and the personal math were pointing in completely different directions, and I'd chosen the professional one, and I needed to believe it was the right call, or the whole 18 months would feel like punishment. My last morning at the Blue Jar before I left, Nora worked the opening shift. She brought my flat white and my almond croissant and set them down with the small professional nod she'd given me every morning for 3 years. The one I'd spent months learning wasn't indifference. Then she sat down across from me, which she'd never done during a shift, and stayed for 4 minutes exactly. She had tables. She couldn't stay longer. And talked about nothing important. A book she was reading. A bridge downtown they were repainting an unexpected color. When she stood up to go back to work, she set a folded receipt on the table. I waited until she was across the room to open it. A heart, same lopsided left side, same upward flick. Underneath it, in small, careful handwriting, "Come back. Not I'll miss you. Not don't go. Just that." An instruction and a door left open, both at once. I put it in my bag with the others. I had a flight at noon. The first month was fine. That's the word I used when people asked. Fine. Which is the linguistic equivalent of a load-bearing wall that's developed a hairline crack you're choosing not to document yet. We talked every night, Nora and I, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 20 minutes, because she had an early shift, and I had a site walk at 6 a.m., and neither of us was willing to be the one who said we should probably sleep. The time difference was only 2 hours, but 2 hours matters more than it sounds when your schedules are already running in opposite directions. Chicago was enormous and gray in February, and I loved it with the specific love of someone who needed to love it to justify being there. The project was everything my boss had promised. Complex, demanding, the kind of work that requires your whole brain at full capacity and then asks for a little more. I was good at it. I knew I was good at it the way you know load tolerances on a structure you've stress tested. Not confidence exactly, more like confirmed data. I worked 12-hour days and came back to a furnished sublet apartment that smelled like someone else's cleaning products and ate takeout on a couch that was not my couch. Nora sent things. Not texts only, actual things, physical mail, which nobody does, which is exactly the kind of person she was. A postcard of the Burnside Bridge with a single sentence on the back. A page torn from a book with a paragraph circled and no explanation. Once, a small drawing on a receipt. She'd saved a blank one from the cafe and drawn the heart and written underneath it "Still here," folded it into an envelope, mailed it to a Chicago address that technically belonged to a stranger's furniture. I kept them in a shoebox on the closet shelf and did not examine what that meant. By month 4, the calls were every other night. Not by decision, by drift, the kind that happens when two people are both too tired to identify the pattern before it's already established. I noticed it the way you notice a structural shift, retroactively, when you look back at the data. One Wednesday, I realized I hadn't heard her voice in 4 days and couldn't account for exactly how that had happened. She called that night before I could call her, which meant she'd been counting too. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, when I tried to explain the feeling without naming it accurately. "I know," I said. "Do you?" That question lived in the sublet apartment with me for the rest of the month. Month 6. I flew back to Portland for a long weekend. We'd been planning it for 8 weeks, dates on both our calendars, a hotel I'd booked because I hadn't renewed my lease, and my old apartment had new tenants who I assumed preferred their privacy. The flight landed 40 minutes late, and by the time I got through baggage claim it was past 10, and I was running on 4 hours of sleep and a level of anticipation that had been quietly pressurizing for weeks. She was waiting outside arrivals with 2 coffees, which was not something I'd asked for or expected, and for a second, I just stood there on the Portland sidewalk in the October drizzle being completely undone by a cardboard cup. She'd remembered exactly how I took it. She'd remembered, and she'd driven to the airport at 10:15 on a Thursday, and she was standing in the rain without a hood because she'd given me her coat that first winter, and I was still wearing it, and she'd just not replaced it. We talked until 3 in the morning, about everything and nothing, the project, her classes, a fight she'd had with her sister, a building in Chicago I'd photographed specifically to show her. In the daylight the next morning, walking along the river in the same spot where she'd asked me to dinner 2 years ago, everything felt so close to what it had been that I almost convinced myself the distance was manageable. The drift was correctable. The hairline crack was still just a hairline. Then Sunday came and I had a 6 a.m. flight Monday, and the arithmetic of it was right there in the room with us all evening, taking up space neither of us acknowledged. She drove me to the airport in the dark, and we sat in the departures lane with the car running, and I could not find a single word that felt adequate for what I was trying to say, which was something in the range of "I didn't know this was going to become something I couldn't do without, and I'm not handling that well." "Same time tomorrow?" I said instead, which was the wrong thing, too light, a deflection dressed as a callback. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Go catch your flight, Callie." And her voice was even and warm and completely opaque in a way it had never been with me before. And I got out of the car, and I went and caught my flight, and I spent the entire 5 hours telling myself it was fine. It was not fine. Month 14. I missed her birthday. Not forgot. Missed. I had it in my calendar in red. I'd ordered something weeks in advance. But there was a structural crisis on site at 7 a.m. that day that required every decision I had. And by the time I surfaced, it was past midnight Portland time, and her phone went to voicemail, and I sat in my site office in a hard hat I'd forgotten to take off and listened to her outgoing message twice before I hung up. She texted the next morning. "It's okay. Call when you can." 4 words that were technically fine and somehow the loneliest thing I'd read in 2 years. I called immediately, and she answered immediately, and we were both careful and kind and adult about the whole thing, which meant we were both performing okayness at each other, and neither of us said the real thing. And when we hung up, I sat in the sublet apartment that still smelled like someone else and understood that fine had finally run out. The project wrapped 4 months early. Budget consolidation. Scope reduction. The kind of ending that isn't anyone's fault and doesn't feel like a victory. I had 6 weeks to decide whether to stay in Chicago or come home, and I made the decision in approximately 40 seconds, which for me is a record. I booked the flight before I called her. I don't know why exactly. Some superstition about not saying a thing until it was already structurally committed. When I told her I was coming back, she was quiet for long enough that I started to worry. And then she said, "When?" And I told her, and she said, "Okay," and nothing else, which was not the response I'd been running in my head for 6 weeks, and I spent the remaining days in Chicago quietly terrified that I'd waited too long. I landed on a Tuesday. 7:42 a.m. The blue jar opened at 7. She was there. She looked the same. That was the first thing I noticed. Standing in the doorway of the blue jar, with my carry-on still in my hand, because I'd come straight from the airport, which in retrospect was either very romantic or very unhinged, and I've made peace with it being both. Same dark curly hair, loose because it was a slow morning, same way of moving through the space like she'd personally memorized every inch of it. She was taking an order at table 3, and hadn't seen me yet, and I stood in the doorway for a full 5 seconds just recalibrating. 2 years is long enough for a city to change its skyline. She looked exactly like she had on the morning I left. Then she looked up. The expression on her face was complicated in a way I hadn't prepared for. Not cold. Nora didn't do cold. It wasn't in her architecture. But careful. Measured. The way you look at something you've been waiting for long enough that the waiting itself has become a structure you've learned to live inside. And now the thing is here, and you're not sure how to dismantle what you built to survive its absence. She held my gaze for a moment, then finished with her customer, set down her notepad, and walked over. "You didn't tell me it was today," she said. "I wanted it to be a surprise," I said, which was half true. The other half was that I'd been afraid of what her voice would sound like if I told her in advance, and she didn't sound the way I needed her to sound. "It's a surprise," she said neutrally. She brought me my usual without my asking. Flat white, almond croissant, corner table, and went back to work. And I sat there eating and watching her and feeling the particular discomfort of being in a room where something needed to be said, and the morning rush was not the right time to say it. She was professional and warm with every customer, laughed at something a regular said, refilled waters with that automatic precision I'd spent 2 years describing to Chicago colleagues who'd asked me what Portland was like. I'd always ended up talking about the cafe. We didn't get to talk until her break at 10. She sat across from me with her own coffee. She always drank it black on slow mornings, and looked at me the way she used to, patient and direct, and waited. "I should have called more," I said. "Yes," she said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "And I should have come back sooner. Yes." "Nora, I know," she said. "I know what you're going to say, and I know you mean it. I just need a minute to—" She stopped, looked at her coffee. "You were gone a long time, Callie, and I was fine. I want you to know that. I didn't fall apart. I built a whole life that worked fine without seeing you every morning." She looked back up. "And now you're here, and I have to figure out what to do with that." It was the most she'd ever said about the 2 years in one sitting. Nora parceled things out carefully, not because she was withholding, but because she meant every word and wouldn't spend them carelessly. The fact that she'd said this much told me the thing I'd been afraid to ask directly. It had cost her something. The waiting, the drift, the birthday I'd missed. She'd paid the tab quietly and alone, and hadn't handed me the bill. And I loved her for that, and was ashamed of it in equal measure. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. Her words from month 4 returned. Something moved across her face. "I remember saying that to you." "It helped," I said. "More than I told you at the time." She was quiet for a moment, both hands around her mug, that particular Nora stillness that wasn't absence but concentration. Outside the cafe, the November street was doing its Portland thing, gray and damp, a woman walking a dog in a raincoat, a cyclist navigating the crosswalk with practiced patience. I'd spent 2 years in a city that moved faster and louder, and I'd liked it, genuinely. And I was sitting here in this small, warm room that smelled like espresso and old wood, and understanding that fast and loud had never once felt like home. "I started running," she said. "What?" "While you were gone. I took it up in month 3. I do the waterfront loop every morning before my shift." She looked faintly amused at herself. "I have no idea what that has to do with anything. I just thought you should know things that are different." "What else is different?" she considered. "I finished my degree. Online, part-time. Took me 18 months. English lit." A pause. "I cried at the Toni Morrison chapter, alone in my apartment at midnight. It was dramatic." "I would have liked to see that." "I know," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that held both the warmth and the ache of it simultaneously, the way good structures hold tension and compression at once. We sat there through the rest of her break, the cafe moving around us, and she told me other things, small ones. The accumulation of 2 years in an ordinary life that had kept going in my absence. A new friend from her running group. A furniture piece she'd built herself from a kit, badly, and was proud of anyway. A poetry collection she'd read 3 times and would probably make me read too. I listened to all of it with the attention of someone who understood they'd missed a significant volume of data and was committed to catching up. When her break ended, she stood, picked up her mug, and paused. "Are you staying in Portland?" she said. "Actually staying." "I signed a lease yesterday," I said, before I got on the plane. A beat. Then, "Same neighborhood?" "4 blocks closer to here," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, that measured expression doing its complicated work, and then something in it settled, not all the way, not immediately, but a degree, the way a structure settles into its foundation when the weight is distributed correctly. "Okay," she said, and then quieter. "I'm glad you're back." She went back to work. I sat at my corner table with my cold flat white and my half-eaten croissant, and my carry-on still parked beside my chair, and I felt the city around me recalibrate into something recognizable. When she brought the check, she set it face down on the table the way she always had. I flipped it over. Heart. Same lopsided left side. Same upward flick. Underneath it, in small, careful handwriting, "We'll figure it out. Not a promise. Not a guarantee. Just 2 people. A corner table. And the willingness to try." I folded the receipt, put it in my bag, came back the next morning. It happened on a Saturday in January, 6 weeks after I came back, which means we'd spent 6 weeks being very careful with each other in a way that felt like tenderness, but was actually something closer to avoidance wearing tenderness as a disguise. We'd been seeing each other most evenings, dinner, walks, long conversations on her couch with the books stacked on every surface, and her cat, whom I'd met for the first time, and who regarded me with the specific suspicion of an animal that had watched someone leave and wasn't ready to forgive the category. We were good at the evenings. The evenings felt like before. What we weren't doing was talking about the 2 years. The fight started over something small, the way real fights always do. Not because small things matter, but because small things are the door. The real thing finally walks through when it's tired of waiting in the hallway. She'd made dinner, something she did occasionally with the same unhurried competence she applied to everything, and I'd arrived 20 minutes late because I'd gotten pulled into a project call I should have rescheduled, and I'd apologized. And she'd said it was fine. And we both knew it wasn't fine, but we sat down and ate anyway. Halfway through dinner, she said, casually, too casually, "Renata called me, while you were gone." I set down my fork. Renata was my colleague, my closest work friend in Portland, and the fact that she'd called Nora, whom she'd met exactly twice, while I was in Chicago meant exactly one thing. "How many times?" I said. "A few," Nora said. "She was checking in. She was worried about you. She didn't tell me she was calling you. I asked her not to." The kitchen was very quiet. The cat had materialized on the counter in the way cats do, silently and without permission. I looked at Nora across the table and felt the 6 weeks of careful evenings arranging themselves into a different shape. Not tenderness, not avoidance, but a structure built around something neither of us had said yet, load-bearing in ways I hadn't calculated. "Why?" I said. She put down her own fork, looked at me with that precision that meant she'd been sitting with this a while. "Because I needed to know you were okay, and you weren't telling me." "I was telling you." "You were giving me the professional version," she said. "The everything is fine version. The I'm handling it version." Marcy paused. "Callie, I asked you 4 times in month 8 if you were struggling, and 4 times you said you were tired. I know the difference between tired and struggling, and I think you do too. The thing about being with someone who listens carefully is that they hear the things you didn't say. I'd spent 2 years curating what I sent across the distance. The good project days, the Chicago architecture I genuinely loved, the funny stories, the manageable complaints. I'd edited out the sublet smell and the takeout containers, and the night I sat on the floor of a Chicago bathroom at 2 a.m., because something in me had finally hit a wall, and I hadn't had the words or the courage to call her and say so. "I didn't want you to worry," I said. "I know," she said. "That's the problem." "That's not, Nora. I was trying to protect. You were trying to manage me," she said, quietly, without accusation, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd been angry. "You decided what I could handle and you rationed accordingly, for 2 years. She looked at her plate. "I'm not a load tolerance, Callie. You can't just calculate what I can bear and distribute accordingly." The sentence hit with the specific precision of someone using your own language against you accurately. I opened my mouth and closed it. She wasn't wrong. I knew she wasn't wrong the way you know a structural flaw you've been hoping won't matter. The knowing was always there, underneath, waiting. "You did the same thing," I said, and I heard how defensive it sounded and said it anyway. "You told me to go. You said the other things weren't reasons for me to stay. You packaged it up and handed it to me, and I had no idea what it cost you until I came back." "Yes," she said. "I did." The admission stopped me. She wasn't deflecting. She was agreeing, sitting straight across from me, owning her half with the same precision she'd applied to mine. "We both did it," she said. "We both decided that protecting the other person was more important than being honest, and then we spent 2 years wondering why the distance felt like more than miles." She looked at me steadily. "I'm not angry at you for going. I was never angry at you for going. I was—" She stopped. Started again. "I was angry that you came back and were still doing it. Still being careful. Still editing. The cat jumped off the counter and left the room, which felt like editorial commentary. I sat across from Nora in her warm kitchen with the dinner going cold between us, and understood that the 6 weeks of good evenings had been both of us circling this exact moment, neither willing to be the one who walked into it first. "The birthday," I said. "It's not about the birthday." "I know, but I want to say it anyway." I met her eyes. "Missing your birthday was the worst I felt in 2 years. Not because it was strategic or professional, because it was yours, and I missed it, and I called too late, and your voicemail picked up, and I sat in a hard hat at midnight, knowing I'd been making the wrong calculations for months, and not knowing how to correct them." She was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen settled around us, the small sounds of a warm apartment on a cold night, and I waited because I'd learned that Nora's silences were never empty. They were where she kept the things that mattered most. "I saved the voicemail," she said finally. "The one you left after. I've listened to it a lot." A pause. "You sounded like yourself, not the edited version." "I was too tired to edit." "I know." The corner of her mouth moved slightly. "Maybe that's the answer. We just talk to each other when we're too tired to manage it." "That's a terrible system," I said. "We can work on the system," she said. "That's kind of the point." We didn't finish dinner. We sat at her kitchen table until well past midnight, saying the things that had been accumulating for 2 years. Not carefully, not managed. Just said out loud to each other, in the warm, imperfect room. It wasn't comfortable. Some of it hurt in the productive way that honest things hurt when they've been waiting too long. By the end of it, we were both quieter, and something had shifted in the apartment's atmosphere, lighter in the structural sense, the way a building breathes differently once the tension is properly distributed. She walked me to the door at 1 a.m., and I stood in the hallway and said, "I'm sorry, for the managing, for the editing, for the birthday and the 4 a.m. floor, and all the versions of it you didn't get to see." She looked at me for a moment, then leaned forward and pressed her forehead to my shoulder. Not a dramatic gesture, just the particular closeness of someone who is done being careful for the night. I put my arm around her, and we stayed like that in the doorway for a while, the cold air coming under the door, the cat reappearing from somewhere to sit at our feet with judgmental patience. "Same time tomorrow?" I said into her hair. "Buy me coffee," she said. "Real coffee, not from the cafe. There's better coffee than the blue jar." She pulled back and looked at me with the first full smile I'd seen all evening. "Come find out." The coffee place she took me to was a converted garage in Southeast, with no sign on the door and 17 different brewing methods written on a chalkboard in handwriting so small you needed to commit to the reading experience. It was the most Portland room I'd ever been in, which is saying something given that I'd lived here for years before Chicago took me. She ordered for both of us without consulting me, 2 pour-overs, single origin, Ethiopian, and paid before I could object. And we took our cups to a bench along the garage wall and sat in the kind of comfortable quiet that only exists on the other side of a hard conversation. We'd cleared something the night before. Not fixed, cleared. There's a difference. Structurally. Fixed implies the problem is gone. Cleared means the obstruction is removed, and now you can see what the actual foundation looks like and decide what to build on it. The foundation, as it turned out, was solid. It had been solid the whole time. We'd just spent 2 years stacking avoidance on top of it, and wondering why the load felt wrong. "I have a question," she said, both hands around her cup, watching the garage fill slowly with the particular Saturday crowd of people who take coffee seriously without being obnoxious about it. "You've been saving it," I said. "Obviously." She looked at me sideways. "What do you actually want? Not from the project, not from your career, from this, from us. If you had to say it out loud right now without editing." It was a fair question and a terrifying one. I looked at my pour-over. The Ethiopian was excellent, which was annoying because I'd been loyal to the Blue Jar for 3 years, and my palate was now apparently negotiable. I thought about what I wanted the way I thought about structural problems, removing the cosmetic layer, finding the thing underneath that actually had to bear the weight. I want to stop treating this like something that needs to be managed, I said. I want to be bad at it in front of you and not apologize for it. I want to know that when something goes wrong at 2 a.m., you're the first call I make, not the last one. I paused. I want to stop leaving. She nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she'd been running the numbers on for a while. Your turn, I said. I want the corner table to be ours, she said, not yours. I want to know what you're working on before it's done. I want you to meet my sister, even though she's a lot, and I want to stop running the waterfront loop alone. She looked at her cup. I want to stop being the person who waits. The garage hummed around us. Someone was explaining a brewing ratio to a patient friend 2 benches over. The light through the industrial windows was the particular flat gray of Portland January that I'd spent 2 years describing to people who'd never seen it, and I'd never once adequately conveyed why it was beautiful. Okay, I said. Okay, she said back. It wasn't a grand declaration. We didn't make promises in the abstract or describe a future in the romantic shorthand people use when they're performing commitment rather than practicing it. We just sat in the converted garage drinking excellent coffee and agreed, quietly and on purpose, to stop circling each other and start moving in the same direction. It was the most adult thing I'd ever done, and it took approximately 40 seconds. Her sister was indeed a lot. I met her 3 weeks later. Her name was Deb. She was 2 years older. She had Nora's eyes and approximately none of Nora's patience. And she spent the first 20 minutes of dinner asking me questions with the friendly aggression of someone conducting a background check over pasta. Where had I been for 2 years, and what made me think Portland was where I was staying? And did I understand that her sister had spent those 2 years being fine, and that fine had a specific cost that I should be aware of? I answered everything honestly, including the part about the bathroom floor at 2 a.m., which Nora hadn't heard yet, and which made Deb put down her fork and look at me differently. She didn't tell me that, Nora said quietly. I know, I said. I'm practicing not editing. Deb pointed her fork at me. I like her, she said to Nora, with the tone of someone issuing a verdict after deliberation. Nora looked at the ceiling briefly, which I was learning was what she did when she was trying not to smile at something she didn't want to encourage. We found a rhythm, not the careful rhythm of the 6 weeks after I came back, but an actual one, the kind with friction and negotiation, and the occasional Tuesday, where we were both tired and short, and said things that required a small apology the next morning. I learned that Nora was impossible to argue with not because she was passive, but because she refused to escalate, which forced me to hear myself, and was frankly humbling. She learned that I needed 30 minutes alone after difficult workdays before I was fit for human company, and she started texting 30-minute buffer. When she could tell from my messages that the day had been hard, which is one of the most loving things anyone has ever done for me. She came to my office once, unannounced, with lunch, sandwiches from a place on Burnside she knew I liked. I was mid-deadline and couldn't stop for more than 15 minutes, but she sat on the edge of my desk and ate her sandwich, and looked at the current drawings spread across the table and asked 3 questions that were better than the ones my junior staff had asked all morning. When she left, my colleague, Renata, materialized from nowhere, looked at the door, looked at me, and said, I take full credit for this, which was inaccurate, but I let her have it. Spring came to Portland the way it always does. Suddenly, without apology, the trees producing blossoms on what feels like a 48-hour schedule. We walked the waterfront loop she'd been running alone for 2 years, her pace and not mine, which was faster than I expected, and she pointed out things she'd noticed in 18 months of the same route. A heron that appeared at the same rock every morning, a section of railing someone had wrapped in yarn sometime in October that was still there, a view of the bridge at a specific angle that only worked at this time of year in this light. She'd built a whole interior life in my absence. A rich, detailed, specific one. And she was showing it to me now. Not performing it, just sharing it. The way you hand someone a book you love. I walked beside her and paid attention, and understood that coming back wasn't the thing I'd done for her. Coming back was the thing I'd done for me, and she was choosing to let me into what she'd built, and those were two very different debts. On the anniversary of the day I'd first asked about the hearts, we went back to the Italian place on the side street in Northeast. Same 12 tables, same candles and wine bottles, same owner who greeted her at the door with the warmth of long familiarity. We got the same table, ordered different things. She'd changed. I'd changed. The restaurant had repainted one wall an unexpected green that worked better than it had any right to. Walking home after, she took my hand at the same corner where our directions used to split, and this time, neither of us turned in opposite directions. We walked the same way. Her apartment was closer, and we both knew it, and I'd stopped keeping track of the nights I didn't go home. "Ask me that question again," I said, somewhere around the second block. "Which one?" "The river one, the first time." She was quiet for half a block. Then, without breaking stride, "Do you want to have dinner with me? Not coffee. Not accidentally. An actual dinner where we both know what it is." "Yes," I said. "Obviously, yes." She squeezed my hand once, brief and certain, and we walked the rest of the way home in the spring dark, the city lit and quiet around us. And I didn't calculate a single thing. I had a plan. Of course I had a plan. I'm the person who color codes her calendar and stress tests load-bearing walls before committing to anything structural. I'd been thinking about it for 4 months, which in Cali terms means I'd built and demolished approximately 11 different versions of the moment, each one more elaborate than the last, and each one quietly wrong in ways I couldn't fully articulate until I was lying awake at 2 a.m. Realizing that I was planning a moment for a person who had spent 3 years drawing hearts on receipts and mailing me book pages with circled paragraphs and driving to the airport at 10:15 on a Thursday with 2 coffees in the rain. Nora didn't need elaborate. Nora needed true. I'd bought the ring 6 weeks earlier. Simple, understated, a thin gold band with a single small stone, the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself, but catches light at unexpected moments. The jeweler had asked me what my partner was like, and I'd said patient and precise and funnier than she lets on. And the jeweler had nodded, like that was a complete enough description to work from, and maybe it was. I'd carried the box in my jacket pocket for 6 weeks, which meant it had been to 3 site visits, 1 permit hearing, and a very boring industry dinner, where it had sat against my ribs like a small structural secret. The plan, in its final version, involved the Italian restaurant and the anniversary, and a specific moment I'd identified between the main course and dessert. Clean, contained, meaningful. A controlled environment with a clear sightline and no structural surprises. I'd even thought about what I was going to say, which is not something I normally do because I find scripted emotion unconvincing, but this felt important enough to deserve preparation. Then it rained for 4 straight days, and on the 5th morning, a Thursday in October, pale gold light coming through the window of the apartment that had quietly become ours over the past several months, without either of us marking the exact moment it happened. Nora made coffee and brought me a cup without asking, and sat across from me at the kitchen table with a book she wasn't reading, and the ring was in my jacket on the hook by the door, and I looked at her in the October light and understood that the plan was wrong. Not wrong because it was bad. Wrong because it was mine, my timing, my controlled environment, my managed moment. And I'd spent the better part of 2 years learning that managing things was what I did when I was afraid, and I wasn't afraid anymore. "Hey," I said. She looked up from the book she wasn't reading. "I have something to ask you." She set the book down. Her expression shifted into that particular Nora attention. Not braced. Not performing anticipation. just present. Fully, completely present. The way she'd been every morning at the corner table, every conversation that mattered, every moment I'd given her something true instead of something managed. I got up, got the jacket, came back to the kitchen table and sat down and put the small box on the table between us without opening it yet, just set it there, and watched her look at it, and then look at me. I practiced this 40 times, I said. I had a whole thing. The restaurant, the right moment, the thing I was going to say. I paused. And then you brought me coffee and the light was doing that thing it does and I realized I didn't want a managed moment. I wanted a Thursday morning in our kitchen. She looked at the box, then at me. Her eyes were doing something complicated and luminous that I was choosing not to examine too closely, or I would lose the ability to form sentences. I'm not good at this, I said, at the saying it part. You know that. You've known it since month 4 when I went to Chicago and didn't tell you what it cost me to get on that plane. I'm working on it. I think I'll be working on it for a long time. I opened the box. The ring caught the October light exactly the way it had in the jewelry store, that quiet, unexpected catch. But I know how to build things that last, and I know what load-bearing looks like. And you are the most structurally sound thing in my life, Nora. And I would like to spend a very long time being bad at the saying it part in front of you. The kitchen was very quiet. The cat had appeared from somewhere and was sitting in the doorway with the dignity of an uninvited witness who has decided to make the best of the situation. Nora looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she looked at me, and her expression had settled into something I didn't have a word for. Not surprised exactly, more like arrived. Like she'd been walking toward this specific kitchen on this specific Thursday, for longer than either of us could account for. That was the 41st version, she said. Yes. It was the best one. I thought so too. She reached across the table and took the ring from the box herself, which I hadn't scripted, and which was so completely her, that I felt something in my chest expand in a way that had nothing to do with architecture, and everything to do with having finally, actually, learned the difference. She looked at it in the light for a moment, turned it once, then held it out to me. Put it on, she said. My hands were steadier than I expected. The ring fit exactly right, which the jeweler had assured me it would, and which I'd verified approximately 4 times, through careful observation of her other rings, which is either very romantic or very architect, depending on your perspective. She looked at her hand, then at me, and the corner of her mouth did the thing it had been doing since the first morning I'd made her laugh. The thing that wasn't quite a smile, and wasn't quite not one. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. My own words, from the river, from the Italian restaurant, from every moment she'd offered me a door and I'd walked through it. She'd been saving them. Of course she'd been saving them. I leaned across the kitchen table and kissed her. Not briefly this time, not a question, but with the full weight of a Thursday morning and 6 weeks of a ring in a jacket pocket and 2 years of distance and 11 months of choosing and all the receipts in the shoebox on the closet shelf. She kissed me back the way she did everything, with complete attention, no performance, just presence. When we pulled back, she was still close, her forehead near mine, the October light doing unreasonable things to the room. The cat had relocated to the table, which was not permitted, and neither of us moved to correct it. I'm going to need you to tell Deb, she said. Absolutely not, I said. That's a you problem. She laughed. The real one. The one that meant she meant it. And I thought about the Tuesday morning 3 years ago, when I'd flipped a receipt and found a small lopsided heart, and told myself it was nothing. The distance between that morning and this one was not a straight line. It was a structure, built incrementally, load by load, choice by choice. Every Thursday morning, and difficult conversation, an airport drive and kitchen table moment stacked carefully on top of the last, until it became something that could hold weight. We finished our coffee. She called Deb. I listened from the kitchen, while Deb's reaction came through the phone loud enough to hear from 6 feet away, and Nora stood in the living room, holding her hand out in the light, while she talked, turning it slightly, watching the ring catch. I washed the cups, made a second round, set hers on the counter for when she was done. Same time tomorrow. The adoption file arrived on a Wednesday in March, 14 months after the proposal, 8 months after the wedding, which was small, exactly as planned, 20 people in Deb's backyard with string lights and the Italian restaurant owner catering, because Nora had asked, and he'd said yes before she finished the sentence. We'd written our own vows, which I'd started drafting 4 months in advance, and Nora had apparently written the morning of in 20 minutes on a notepad. And hers were better, which she has never once mentioned, and which I think about regularly. The file was thick. Cream-colored folder, the agency's name in the corner, our names typed side by side on the tab, in a font that was aggressively ordinary for something that felt this significant. I'd picked it up from the mailbox on my way in, and set it on the kitchen table and stood looking at it for a full minute before I called Nora, who was at the cafe finishing a shift, and said simply, "It came." She was home in 22 minutes. I know because I didn't move from the kitchen table. We'd started the process 2 years earlier, before the proposal even, in the way you start things when you're not ready to name them yet. A conversation that began as hypothetical and kept returning with more specific questions attached each time, until one evening on the waterfront she'd said, "I think I want to be someone's parent." And I'd said, "I know," and we'd looked at each other in the way that meant the hypothetical was done. The process had been long. That's the word every resource used, and every word fell short of the actual experience of it. The paperwork and the home studies and the waiting, and the specific grief of files that came close and then didn't, 2 of them, both of which we'd handled privately and together, and not particularly well, in the way that real loss resists handling. Nora had cried in the car after the second one, and I'd sat in the passenger seat and held her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing structural to say, nothing that bore weight, just the fact of being there in the car in the parking lot for as long as she needed. Now there was a folder on the kitchen table. She sat across from me and we opened it together, not dramatically, just both of our hands on the cover, a practical decision about a physical object that also happened to be the most significant thing we'd ever touched. Inside, a photograph, a name, a birthday, a history summarized in careful clinical language that couldn't begin to contain what it was describing. A little girl, 4 years old, in a photo taken at the agency, with the particular brightness of a child who smiles at cameras because someone has taught her that cameras mean something good is coming. Nora looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. "Her name is Rosie," she said finally, which I knew because I'd read it, but hearing Nora say it out loud made it real in a different register. "Rosie," I said. We sat with the folder between us and read everything twice, together, then separately, then together again because some of it required comparison. She had a birthday in November. She liked drawing according to the file, and had a specific attachment to a stuffed rabbit she'd named something the file spelled phonetically, because the caseworker hadn't been certain of the pronunciation. She'd been in 2 placements already. She was, by every measure that mattered, waiting. "I'm terrified," I said. Not a confession exactly, more an observation about my own structural state. "I know," Nora said. "Me too. I don't know how to do this." "Nobody does," she said. "I've read approximately 40 books on the subject, and they all agree that the knowing comes after." She looked at the photograph again. "She draws." "You draw," I said. Nora looked up at me. "Hearts on receipts. That's my full range." "It's a good range." We called the agency the next morning. There were more steps. There were always more steps. The process had taught us that much. Visits and evaluations and paperwork that seemed designed to test whether you could maintain administrative composure under conditions of profound emotional disruption. which I handled better than expected because I'd had practice. Nora was steady in the visits in the way she was steady everywhere, present and specific and warm without performing warmth, and the caseworker said afterward that Rosie had asked about the lady with the curly hair, which Nora received with the particular expression she used when something landed too accurately for a composed response. Rosie came home on a Friday in September. I want to describe that day accurately, which means admitting that nothing I'd built professionally, no structure I'd designed, no deadline I'd met, no project that had gone exactly right, had prepared me for standing in our living room watching a 4-year-old examine our bookshelves with the focused attention of a person conducting a serious audit. She touched the spines carefully, one by one. She found the stuffed cat Deb had sent as a welcome gift and held it at arm's length for evaluation. She looked at our framed photographs on the wall, pointed at one from our wedding, and said, "Is that you?" to Nora, with the directness that 4-year-olds deploy without mercy. "That's me," Nora said, crouching to Rosie's level. "You look different," Rosie said. "My hair was up," Nora said. Rosie considered this. Then she pointed at me. "Is that one you?" "That's me," I said. Another evaluation pause. "Do you live here too?" "I do," I said. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're filing new data. Then she went back to the bookshelves. Nora looked at me over her head with an expression that was equal parts undone and completely certain, the way she looked at things she'd decided about fully and finally. That night, Rosie, asleep in the room we'd painted a yellow she'd chosen herself from paint swatches with the seriousness of a professional. We sat on the kitchen floor with our backs against the cabinet, too tired to make it to the couch, 2 cups of tea going cold beside us. The apartment was quiet in a different way than it had been the day before. Fuller, somehow. Weighted with presence. She put herself to bed, Nora said. I didn't know 4-year-olds did that. She's been taking care of herself for a while, I said. Nora was quiet for a moment. We're going to have to be very patient. You're already very patient. You're getting better at it, she said, which was generous and also accurate. I'd been working on it for years with mixed but improving results. We sat on the kitchen floor until the tea was cold, and the apartment stayed quiet, and then we got up and checked on Rosie. Once, briefly, the door opened just enough for the hallway light to confirm the small shape under the yellow room covers, and went to bed. I lay in the dark thinking about the photograph in the cream folder, the stuffed rabbit with the phonetically spelled name, the bookshelf audit, and the particular weight of a life that had just doubled in complexity and meaning simultaneously. Hey, I said in the dark. Yeah, Nora said. We're someone's parents. A pause. Then quietly, with the full weight of it. We are. I reached for her hand in the dark, the way I reached for structural solutions in difficult projects. Not dramatically, just certainly, because it was the right thing and I knew where to find it. She laced her fingers through mine without looking, the way you do things that have become necessary. Outside, Portland was doing something with the September sky that I couldn't see but could feel through the window. The particular quality of a city settling into fall, the year turning, the trees beginning their slow and certain change. Same time tomorrow, different everything. Nora's mother died on a Tuesday in April, 11 years after Rosie came home, which means Rosie was 15 and doing homework at the kitchen table when the call came, and she looked up at the sound of Nora's voice and understood before anyone explained anything. That's the thing about kids who've learned early to read rooms. They don't need the words. She closed her laptop quietly and came and sat beside Nora on the couch and didn't say anything, just put her head on Nora's shoulder. And Nora held the phone with one hand and put the other arm around her daughter, and I stood in the kitchen doorway watching the two of them and felt the specific helplessness of loving people who are in pain. You cannot engineer away. Her mother's name was Ruth. I'd known her for 9 years. We'd driven down to Medford the first Thanksgiving after the proposal, me white-knuckling a casserole dish in the passenger seat, while Nora drove with the particular calm of someone returning to a place that holds complicated things. Ruth had opened the door and looked at me for exactly 2 seconds, and then pulled me into a hug that had the same quality as Nora's stillness. Warm, unhurried, completely certain. She'd shown me photographs after dinner, childhood ones. Nora at 7 with the same dark curly hair, and an expression of focused patience on her small face that was so recognizable I'd laughed out loud, and Nora had said, "Don't," from across the room without looking up from the dishes. She'd had a long illness, the managed kind, the kind that teaches everyone involved a particular endurance. We'd driven down monthly for the last 2 years, sometimes all 3 of us, sometimes just Nora when the visits were harder, when Ruth was having a difficult week, and Nora needed to be her daughter without also being anyone else. Those drives back to Portland were the ones where Nora was quiet in the specific way that meant she was carrying something heavy and had not yet found the place to set it down. I'd learned not to fill that quiet. I'd learned to drive and let the miles do what they could. The funeral was small, the way Ruth had wanted it. Immediate family, a few longtime friends, a minister from her church who'd known her for 30 years and spoke about her with the ease of someone describing a person they genuinely liked. Deb gave a eulogy that was funny and precise and fell apart exactly once, at the end, in a way that felt honest rather than performed. Nora sat in the front row between Rosie and me and held both our hands and did not cry during the service, which I knew was not composure but postponement. Nora processed privately, always had, the grief going inward first before it found its way out. She cried 4 days later. We were in the garden. We'd bought a house 3 years after Rosie came home, a 1940s craftsman in Northeast, with a garden that had been neglected for years, and which Nora had been quietly rehabilitating ever since, with the same patient competence she applied to everything. She was pulling weeds in the April afternoon, and I was reading on the back steps, and I heard her stop and looked up, and she was sitting back on her heels in the garden, with her hands in her lap, and crying in the steady, non-dramatic way that meant it had finally found the way out. I put down my book, went and sat in the dirt beside her without asking, because there was nothing to ask. She leaned into me, and I put my arm around her, and we sat in the garden while she cried. The April light going slowly gold around us, the weeds still half pulled. She didn't say anything for a long time, and I didn't either, because the quiet was doing the right work. And I'd learned, over 15 years, to trust it. She liked you from the first minute, she said eventually. She told me that night after Thanksgiving. She said, "That one's a keeper," which from my mother was basically a formal declaration. "I know," I said. "She told me too, at Christmas, the 2nd year." Nora pulled back slightly to look at me. "She told you?" She pulled me aside after dinner. Said, "My daughter doesn't choose lightly, so don't be careless with it." I paused. I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything anyone's ever said to me. Nora was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. The rose bush along the back fence had finally started to come in this year. She'd planted it the spring after we moved in, and it had taken 3 years to establish itself properly, the way good things often do. "She knew," Nora said, "about the 2 years while you were in Chicago. I told her after you came back. She wasn't angry. She just said, 'People need time to understand what they have.' Like it was that simple." "It sort of is," I said. "It sort of is," she agreed. Rosie brought tea out 20 minutes later. She was 15, and had decided several months ago that making tea during difficult moments was her specific contribution to family emotional management, which was so precisely her that neither of us had ever commented on it directly for fear of making her self-conscious about it. She set the cups on the back step and sat beside us in the dirt without being invited. The 3 of us in a line in the April garden, and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of eloquence. She'd grown into herself in the 11 years since the bookshelf audit. Quiet in the Nora way, perceptive in a way that sometimes startled people who weren't paying attention. with a dry humor she'd developed somewhere around age 10 that she deployed sparingly and with excellent aim. She drew constantly, sketchbooks filled with careful, detailed observations, buildings and birds, and the people on the waterfront loop she sometimes ran with Nora in the mornings. She had Nora's patience and something of my precision, and something entirely her own that belonged to no one but herself, which is what you hope for when you love someone small enough to influence and are terrified of getting it wrong. We got things wrong. Regularly. Parenting had turned out to be exactly what every book had warned. Nothing like the theory, everything like the practice, a continuous experiment in applied imperfection. There had been hard years, a particularly difficult one around Rosie's 12th birthday, when old griefs had resurfaced and required more than we'd known how to give at first. We'd gotten help, family therapy, patient and practical, the kind that gives you better tools rather than better feelings about your inadequate ones. We'd worked. The working had mattered. The garden slowly went from afternoon gold to the longer light of early evening. At some point, Nora's tea went cold, and Rosie went inside to start dinner. She'd been cooking seriously for 2 years, another thing she'd developed on her own terms. And Nora and I stayed in the garden a while longer, her head on my shoulder, the rose bush moving slightly in the evening air. "I keep thinking about things I didn't ask her," Nora said. Recipes, stories about when she was young, whether she was ever really afraid of anything. A pause. "You run out of time before you run out of questions." "Tell me the ones you remember," I said. "About her. I'll remember them with you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she started talking. Small things, specific ones. The kind of details that don't make it into eulogies but are the actual texture of a person. Her mother's handwriting, which was terrible and particular. The way she laughed at her own jokes before the punchline. The specific soup she made when anyone was sick, with a spice combination she'd never fully disclosed. A garden of her own, in Medford, less patient than this one, more exuberant. Flowers she'd planted without a plan and loved for their disorder. I listened to all of it. I held the weight of it alongside her in the evening garden, and understood that this was what I'd signed up for on the Thursday morning with the ring box on the kitchen table. Not the easy years, not the managed moments, but this too. The sitting in the dirt, the cold tea, the questions that ran out of time. Rosie called us in for dinner from the back door. The light had gone soft and purple, the way April evenings go when they're being generous. Nora stood, brushed the garden dirt from her knees, and held out her hand to pull me up. I took it, same as always. The cafe opened on a Tuesday in March, because of course it did. It took 14 months from the walk on the waterfront to the morning we unlocked the door for the first time. Permits and inspections, and a space in Northeast that had been a print shop for 40 years and had good bones and terrible lighting and exactly the right dimensions for what Nora had described on the bridge. I'd drawn the plans myself, which was the most personally invested I'd been in a project since the Chicago development 3 decades earlier, for entirely different reasons. The corner table was positioned exactly as we'd discussed, relative to the window, angled to catch the morning light in the specific way that made a Tuesday feel manageable. Rosie drove down from Seattle for the opening. Park came with her, and Deb, and a collection of people who'd accumulated over the years the way people accumulate around someone like Nora, quietly, drawn by the specific gravity of someone who listens and remembers and shows up. The original owner of the blue jar sent flowers with a note that said simply about time. The young couple who'd run it in its final years came in for coffee and stayed 2 hours. The man from table 4, the one Nora had remembered took no sugar 40 years ago, was gone now. But his daughter had heard about the opening somehow, and came in and said her father had talked about the blue jar his whole life, and Nora had held her hands and said she remembered him and meant it. We called it the receipt. Deb had suggested it, half joking, and then everyone had gone quiet in the way that meant it was obviously right, and we were all slightly annoyed we hadn't said it first. The logo, designed by Rosie, who'd picked up her mother's drawing in her own particular way, was a small lopsided heart, slightly uneven on the left side, with a tiny upward flick where the pen had lifted. I took the corner table on the first morning. Same order, flat white, almond croissant, now made in our own kitchen by a baker Nora had found through the running group. Someone who understood that an almond croissant was not a vehicle for innovation, but a promise kept daily. The cafe filled slowly, the way good rooms fill, without urgency, people finding their places. Nora moved through the space the way she'd always moved through spaces, unhurried, present, memorizing it as she went. She brought my order without my asking, set down the flat white, the croissant, and then, separately, deliberately, a folded receipt, face down, with no food attached to it. Just the receipt. 63 years old, 36 years since the first one. I looked at her standing at my corner table in the Tuesday morning light with her dark curly hair. Gray now mostly, worn loose the way she wore it on slow mornings, which was most mornings now, which was something I had not adequately prepared for how much I would love. And she had the expression she'd been refining since the beginning. Patient. Precise. The corner of her mouth doing the thing. "You're going to do this every day," I said. "Obviously," she said. She went back to work. I picked up the receipt, turned it over. The heart was there, same lopsided left side, same upward flick where the pen had lifted quickly, same black pen, same slight pressure variation. The mark of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become the hand's own memory, independent of instruction. Underneath it, in the small, careful handwriting I'd been reading for 36 years, she'd written 4 words. Still waiting for you. Not still here. Not come back. Not any of the other things she'd written over the decades on the backs of receipts I'd kept in a shoebox that had migrated from apartment to sublet to house to the shelf in our bedroom where it still sat, slightly battered, full. This, the beginning and the end of it, the thing that had been true on the Tuesday she'd drawn the first heart, and was true on this Tuesday, and everyone in between. She had been waiting, specifically, for me. And the waiting had never been passive but active, a choice renewed daily, a door kept open on purpose. I read it twice, looked up. She was at the counter, taking an order from someone who'd come in for the first time, and didn't know yet that this would become their place, their Tuesday, their room that remembered them. She wasn't looking at me. She was doing what she'd always done, being completely where she was, giving it her full attention, making someone feel like the city was navigable and warm. I folded the receipt, put it in my pocket, picked up my pen. I'd been carrying a pen in my jacket since the morning 36 years ago, when I'd held it next to her drawing on the back of a cafe receipt and done forensic analysis on a doodle at 7:51 in the morning, and I had never once in all those years done what I did now, which was unfold the receipt, smooth it on the table, and draw something on it. Small, slightly lopsided, an upward flick on the left side where I lifted the pen. When she came back to clear my cup, I set it on the table face down between us without explaining. She looked at it, looked at me, picked it up and turned it over. The heart was there, underneath it, in my handwriting, the architect's handwriting, precise and slightly cramped. I'd written 4 words back. Always noticed. Always you. She read it once. The corner of her mouth did the thing, and then the thing became the full smile, the real one, the one that meant she meant it, the one I'd been collecting for 36 years and had never once gotten tired of. She folded the receipt and put it in her apron pocket and went back to work. The cafe filled around me. The morning light came through the window at the angle we'd planned, landing on the corner table the way it was supposed to, the way good structures do what they were designed to do when you've taken the time to get them right. Rosie was behind the counter helping, which she'd insisted on for the first week, her and Park both. and I could see her from the corner table showing someone the menu, with the focused patience that was so completely Nora and so completely her own. I didn't check my email. I didn't open my laptop. I sat at the corner table with my flat white going lukewarm, and my half-eaten almond croissant and 36 years of receipts in a shoebox on a bedroom shelf, and watched Nora move through the room she'd built, unhurried and certain, and thought about a Tuesday morning when I'd flipped a piece of thermal paper and found something small and lopsided and slightly improbable, and told myself it was nothing. It was everything. It had always been everything. I just needed 36 years and a corner table and a woman with extraordinary patience to understand the load it was bearing. Same time tomorrow.